And I can hear that in Paul's writing when he expresses his astonishment that the Galatians are so quick to go back, to grab onto something that will bind them again, to a counterfeit gospel. He writes, there are some who are confusing you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. Now, the Greek word translated as pervert here can also be translated as disguise or distort. Friends, not everything that passes for the gospel is in fact the good news of Christ. The gospel can be misrepresented, even in the slightest of ways, and lose its liberating nature. Like when something is added to the gospel, like in Galatians, the law, which we're going to talk about in this series, or when we make it the gospel plus works, it becomes distorted. Not completely different. In fact, in some ways, it still looks like the gospel, but it's not. Today, the kinds of things that we see like this are the gospel plus capitalism, or the gospel plus nationalism, the gospel plus celebrity or materialism. And it's counterfeit. And it's the same way when something is taken away from the gospel. Close, but distorted. Like the gospel minus restorative justice, or the gospel minus repentance, or the gospel minus liberation for all. There is one gospel. There is not another. And Paul writes that anyone who proclaims something different should be accursed. They should be subject to the judgment of the Lord. And it's right for us to ask ourselves and our community, what are the counterfeit gospels we're at risk to fall prey to? What are we tempted to add or take away to the gospel in order to make it more palatable for ourselves or to make it more difficult for somebody else? Is the gospel we proclaim founded and rooted in liberation for all, in freedom? Does it stand in resistance to this present evil age? And what does this gospel bind us to? In verse 10, Paul writes that the one thing he's still bound to, he writes that he is a servant or a slave of Christ. And in the gospel, we trade our bondedness to the present age to be bound to Christ. But in being bound to Christ, we're truly free. So does the gospel we proclaim bind us to anything other than Christ? Does this gospel lead to freedom and transformation?